Can you hear me in the back? In my haste, I didn't thank Mark Schwartz for his talk, and David did a fascinating talk as well. So two really interesting presentations. Thank you. Next up, we have Alexandra Syphard. She is a senior research scientist at the Conservation Biology Institute in Corvallis. And I think she's here somewhere, but I haven't seen her yet. So come on down, you are the next contestant. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. My co-authors are Helen Regan and Janet Franklin, and I'd also like to acknowledge our funding source for the research I'll be talking about today. So obviously we're all sitting here because we're worried that climate change may have dramatic impacts on plant species persistence and distribution. In fact, some people are starting to say it's probably the single greatest threat to plant diversity. So, as we've already been talking about, why might this be? Well, climate change has the potential to shift the extent and the location of available suitable habitat. So if this is beyond the dispersal distance of a species, it will negatively impact recruitment and establishment. So early life stages are probably very vulnerable. But also climate change can affect adults through factors such as drought stress. So, given these concerns, conservation practitioners and decision makers need to make decisions now about changes that are going to happen in the future. And this is hard because projecting what those changes might be is very complex and it's very complicated. Some notable reasons why are that climate change is likely going to vary in space and time. Climate velocity, as was just mentioned. Also, different species are likely to have different response to climate change and have different responses to different climatic variables. And then, of course, you have the unintuitive or unexpected type of response where a species shifts downhill because of the role of topographic buffering, for example. So, the primary approach that's been used for projecting impacts of climate change on plant species has been species distribution models, also known as envelope models, and these can address some of the challenges. They can provide spatially and temporally explicit projections and maps. They are starting to include more ecologically relevant variables, such as climatic water deficit. And then there are also improved downscaling techniques, so resolution may be getting finer in space. The problem is that there are some deeper challenges, and species distribution models can't address all of these. One issue is that species distribution models are really only estimating the exposure of a species to climate change. They're not actually looking at what a population response might be. They're not accounting for demographic response, which ultimately leads to plant persistence. And then, climate is not the only thing that's affecting plant species. It's just one of many factors of multiple threats that may exacerbate climate change, mediate it, it may completely override the effects of climate change. And all of these threats are interacting. Land use change contributes to altered fire regimes, which contributes to invasive species, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very complex. So to address some of these challenges, my colleagues and I developed a modeling framework, and we've applied it to 5 endemic plants, so I'll show you briefly some of the results of that today, with really the hope of ending with some take-home messages. And what it is we've linked species distribution models with a stochastic population model. So using detailed demographic data, we are estimating plant species persistence or extinction risk. We also are using this modeling framework to look at climate change relative to other threats, including projected land use change, which is urban growth, different fire frequencies, and invasive species. And we're asking the basic questions, so what are the relative impacts of these threats, And are there any management options that may or may not be more effective for these species? And then also we've been asking the question, so how does the ranking of threats and management options vary based on across or within species functional types? Is there any way that you could generalize across species what the threats might be? So we looked in Southern California shrublands and woodlands, the study areas here on the right. And in our study area, fire is an important ecological process. It shapes ecosystem structure and function. And there are diverse post-fire response strategies that are often used to define functional types. Part of this is that other species traits may be correlated, such as dispersal or drought resistance. So the 5 species that I'll briefly discuss today include a resprouting oak tree, Quercus anglemanii, an obligate seeding coniferous tree. It has serotinous cones, Tacati cypress, meaning it requires fire key germination. 2 Ceanothus evergreen chaparral shrub species, also obligate cedars. And finally, we looked at an annual herb as well, Acanthomintha ilicifolia, which doesn't necessarily have a post-fire response strategy. Instead, it can establish from seed after a fire. So this chart is giving you an overview of what our approach is. So we start with the species distribution model, which most of you, I assume, know, correlates observations of species locations with different environmental variables that are associated with their distribution, climate, terrain, soil type. And we projected the models onto current climate conditions and then projected the model onto projections of future climate conditions and did an interpolation to produce annual maps of projected habitat suitability. For this research, we looked at 2 different climate models, PCM, which looks at warm and dry, GFDL, which looks at warm and wet for PCM, hot and dry for GFDL, under the A2 scenario, downscaled by the Flints to 90 meters. Then using this suitable habitat, we overlaid it with urban growth projections that we developed using the Sleuth urban growth model. So any area that's considered suitable, but also is projected to become urbanized, is then no longer considered suitable, resulting in a series of habitat maps showing dynamic available habitat that we threshold into patches that we then put into the population model. So the patches in the population model are also further divided into occupied, which would be where the species is currently located, versus suitable, which is where the habitat is assumed to be suitable for the species. And the patches are connected by the dispersal distance of the species. We used RAMIS, which is a spatially explicit, stochastic, age or stage-based matrix model. We have stochastic vital rates, and we looked at variable fire events. So fire is a Weibull hazard function that can affect reproduction. It can also affect adult mortality. We ran each scenario 1,000 times for 100 years. The carrying capacity of the habitat patches is a function of their size, as well as the quality as determined by the species distribution model. Population density is based on published estimates. So before I show you species-specific results, the first thing I want to show you, this is just an example of one of our climate models looking at temperature between current and future. And what you can see in these red areas is that most of the warming was projected to happen in the interior of the study area. On the other hand, most of our projected urban development, in red here on the right, was projected to happen along the coast. So if you look at where our species are distributed, this meant that the species were differentially affected by different drivers of habitat change. So we have Ceanothus greggii, Engelmann oak, and Tacati cypress in the green, pink, and blue that had experienced a lot of habitat loss due to climate change, whereas Acanthomintha ilicifolia and Ceanothus verrucosus were embedded within an urban matrix, and so they were more impacted by urban development. So these charts that I'm going to show you, along the y-axis is expected minimum abundance, which is the average smallest population across the 1,000 replicates. Along the x-axis are average fire return intervals going from very frequent fire, returns every 10 to 20 years, all the way up to infrequent fire up to 100 years. And then these curves represent habitat scenarios. So this is just one example that we looked at, but for Ceanothus verrucosus, it was affected. So this is looking at population abundance on the habitat scenarios. This is status quo. So both climate and urban habitat loss resulted in substantial population decline when they were simulated by themselves, but when climate and urban were simulated together, there was an exacerbation of the population decline. What the most important thing, however, is that regardless of these differences over here, the very smallest populations of all occurred when the fire return interval was less than about 20 or 25 years. So if you have a landscape with that much fire on it, that's what your threat is. This is now looking at the two other obligate cedars located in the interior of the study area. Urban growth had a negligible impact. I don't have it on these charts. The main thing here is the difference in the y-axis. So you're going from abundance of millions down to thousands, and that resulted in a corresponding predicted population decline with that climate change. But once again, if you zoom in to the scale that really shows the climate change, these habitat impacts are really only happening at longer fire return intervals. If you have really frequent fire, you have the lowest population of all. And for both Ceanothus verrucosus and Tepati cypress, we looked at a range of potential management options to mitigate habitat loss from urban growth or climate change. So we looked at preventing urban growth from happening through reserves, and we also looked at the potential for assisted migration, basically taking seeds or seedlings and moving them to areas that are predicted to be suitable as habitat in the future. And the results, I'll explain this in just a minute, but the results are basically the same in that the relative effectiveness of reserves or assisted migration varied based on what climate model we used, and consistently, no management option was effective at all if you had very high fire frequency. But there was some buffering of the effect. So the two blue lines, this is the chart you saw before. The two blue lines are just showing you the relative increase in population relative to not having a reserve. So reserve versus no reserve. Moving on to our respouting tree, the oak. Once again, we have no habitat change versus climate change, and if you look at the y-axis, you see there's about a 10-fold decrease in habitat, which resulted in a 10-fold approximately decrease in population. We looked at, what I'm showing is different dispersal distances simulated for this species. And when you're looking at a climate change scenario, we found that increasing dispersal distance would mitigate the effect of climate change habitat loss on population. The problem is you have to actually have species, or this dispersal distance became unrealistically large. The other thing is that even though resprouters tend to be more resilient to high fire frequency, we did see a slight fire frequency effect in that populations were lower with more frequent fire. Also not shown is we looked at the potential for climate change to affect fecundity through the frequency of masting events, and if climate change were to reduce masting frequency, it further exacerbated population decline, showing that population effects are underestimated if you just use species distribution models, at least for this species. And finally, for our herb, Acanthomintha. So we had fairly uncertain demographic data for this species, and we viewed it as an opportunity then to do a sensitivity analysis of our modeling framework to see where is most of the uncertainty coming from based on the type of species distribution model we used, the type of climate model, urban growth scenario. And what we found by looking at the results, overwhelmingly the largest amount of uncertainty in the simulated results came from which species distribution model we used. And this was then followed by, in order, climate model, urban growth scenario, population model structure. The effect of different populations vary depending on which parameter you're looking at, but for this species, those parameters for which we had most data were the most sensitive, so that was actually a good thing. And it shows, at least for this species, that filling in the gaps in a population model may not be as important as figuring out what's going on with your species distribution model, because there's a lot of uncertainty with that. The other thing we found, though, is that even though there were variation in results depending on which assumption we used, consistently we came up with the same ranking in management options. And for this species, the best choice is reducing invasive species, followed by reducing fire frequency. If those could be done, of course, that's an assumption. So everything that I just showed you, I want to boil it down to three main conclusions. One is that when you're projecting climate change impacts, it's important to consider other threats. In our model, there was substantial population decline that corresponded with suitable habitat loss due to species distribution models, but our sensitivity analysis, of course, showed that that decline and projecting that is highly uncertain based on the kind of model you're using and the assumptions that go into it. On the other hand, at least for obligate cedars, frequent fire is the single greatest threat. It doesn't matter about urban growth or climate change. If you have really high fire frequency on the landscape, which fire frequency has been increasing in our study area, it's an existing, ongoing, important threat. And managing for climate change is not going to be very effective if you have really high fire frequency on the landscape. It also affected resprouters in the herb. And of course, in terms of other threats, land use change may exacerbate habitat decline, but direct land use change isn't the only factor. If you have urban development that goes out into the wildlands, that has the potential to dramatically increase fire frequency. So there's many indirect interactions and effects between all of these threats that we haven't actually modeled. The other thing is in terms of functional types. So fire response functional type, it did a pretty good job of telling us which functional type was most sensitive to frequent fire. But what's most important is the spatial context, because the distribution of the threats on the landscape, where most of the climate change was projected to occur versus where most of the land change was expected to occur, this is what's really driving the projected impacts. So you have to consider that, and maybe functional types need to be reconsidered. And then also, it's important when projecting impacts of climate change on plants to consider population dynamics. We had results where we had exacerbated declines based on dispersal capacity, fecundity, and other vital rates. So the last slide is that, of course, there's additional considerations. There's the role of microclimates mediating range shifts, which are potentially going to impact how climate change affects plants. There's a need to directly measure what the species-climate relationships are. Species interactions, of course, are going to affect how plants are going to be distributed in the future, adaptation. And we are currently dealing with all of these right now in another project where we're looking at 5 tree species in the Tehachapi and Sierra Nevada, taking garden trials and moving them all the way up to landscape models. So stay tuned on that.
We could take one question.
I guess